Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to be switching this up back and forth, by the way. There's only one on the entire east end. We're going to share. My name is Paul Whalen, and I'm a partner at Robert Stern Architects, and I work with Michael every day. We work on a lot of the tall buildings in New York. But we have places out here, and we work on our little gardens, and we love gardens. And so a few years ago, we took a wonderful garden tour in southern England, where the best ones are located. And so we want to share it with you. What you're going to see is that we really have a kind of an architectural view of these gardens. We're not plantsmen. A plantsman would come up here and talk about every plant. We're going to talk a lot about the structure of the gardens and how they come together and how they're organized. And I have to do my own sitting. Okay. So our tour was centered on southern England and takes us on an arc around London from Oxford, where Ravisham and Blenheim are located, through the Cotswolds and into Kent or Sissinghurst. So the reason we're doing this talk for you is we're hoping to show you some pretty gardens, but also we want to introduce some history and vocabulary that you can use when you walk around your own garden or when you go on a garden tour. To start, we'll provide you with a brief overview of the history of landscape design in as much as it refers or connects to the English garden. The English garden grew from a variety of international influences, many of which will become evident throughout this presentation. We begin in the 1500s with the Renaissance Italian garden, typically arranged on dramatic hillside terraces. These landscapes reflect Italy's natural steep topography, and their interest is derived not from flowers, but from room making, from textures of green, paving patterns, and cascading water features. They're very architectural. The Villa d'Este, completed in 1575, is a classic example. You can see in the section drawing on the left the stepping hillside gardens that the Villa d'Este is famous for, and on the right a plan organized around primary and secondary axes that lead to garden rooms. The spaces are defined by parterres, which are low geometric plantings framed with clipped boxwood, something to remember. This is a bit of a 101, by the way, for you guys who are super sophisticated. We're hitting on all the basics. These axes frequently culminate in picturesque views of the surrounding landscape. The French Baroque garden followed in the 1600s and is characterized by grandeur and theatricality. As you can see here at Versailles, Louis XIV's garden finished in 1661. Singular forced perspectives combined with decorative parterres, reflecting pools, gravel paths, all seem drawn upon a flat, endless earth, a symbol of the power of the French monarchy. Let's step aside for a moment to go to 10th century China, where an even more ancient garden design tradition aimed to evoke a celestial idea on earth. Rocks, plants, and water were arranged in irregular, auspicious compositions. Starting with the Tang Dynasty in the 10th century, as you can see on the left, stylized landscape drawings were major influences on the design of these gardens. Throughout this tour, you're going to see a recurring theme of the relationship between painting and landscape design. In the 1600s, Asian influences reached England primarily through Dutch trade. The earliest known example of an Asian-inspired garden in England was created in the late 1600s by Sir William Temple, the diplomat who had served as ambassador to the Netherlands. Here on the right is his irregular tinged garden, growing out of an older geometric design. Also in the 1600s, landscape painting starts to become an important influence on garden design. Claude Lorraine depicted mythological scenes in idealized natural settings, often populated with classical ruins and deities. These works shaped contemporary English tastes and inspired garden designers. I find it fascinating that these paintings were done at the same time that Versailles was being done, by the way. They're so completely different in the way that they look at nature. Then in the early 1700s, out of this blend of global influences and the English climate, the classic English landscape art emerged. Its most influential designer, Lancelot Capability Brown, rose to prominence in the mid-1700s. His vision featured ways of organizing ancient hunting grounds with sweeping lawns, isolated or clustered trees, classic temples and statues, and distant focal points. I was on the wrong image. This landscape at Chatsworth House that you see here exemplifies the style. A century later, in the mid-1800s, we see the advent of the Victorian garden. These were dramatic assemblies of color, and people still consider them a little trashy, and patterns made from tropical plants imported from around the British Empire. A key feature of these gardens was carpet bedding, brightly colored annuals arranged into shaped beds to create showy patterns. Overall, these Victorian extravaganzas went beyond being gardens to becoming spectacles of the empire. The arts and crafts gardeners loathed them. Slightly later, individuals in the late 1800s arts and crafts movement, reacting to industrialization and internationalism, searched for the essence of England, looking to medieval myths, Elizabethan and Tudor manners, and natural landscapes for inspiration. Writers like John Ruskin were a foundational inspiration. William Robinson, who popularized the cottage garden through extensive writing, publishing, as well as his own garden. Robinson's own country house, Greytime Manor, reflects his revolutionary approach. Hardy perennials are arranged in naturalistic drifts and encouraged to merge into the countryside and to climb the manor walls, blurring boundaries between untouched nature, garden, and architecture. In the slightly later 1800s, the arts and crafts garden was perfected by architect Edmund Lutyens and landscape designer Gertrude Jekyll. Goddard's, designed in 1927, here is a good example. Outdoor rooms extend the house into the garden. Local plants win out over tropical imports. Walls and steps reflect simple and local architectural traditions. The layouts were architectural like a house, but in contrast, the plants were laid out naturalistically. Often there's a bit of a battle between the plants and geometries of the garden. But now, over to Michael to begin our journey. It's interesting, by the way, that our sense of the irritated garden essentially starts with this kind of arts and crafts garden.
Yeah. We only have one. We have to share it. And we're used to sharing. Because we're partners. Okay, so Paul talked, we're going to move forward. So Paul talked about all these basic ideas that come around the world and influence the English garden. So what we're going to start right now, we're going to go through like 8 gardens, and you'll see the evolution of the English garden from the 18th century to the 21st century. So the first house we start with is Rovam. We're in the early 18th century. It's located north of Oxford. The garden was first completed in 1744 under the direction of General James Dormer, a veteran of the Battle of Blenheim. So in 1737, William Kent was hired by General Dormer to make modifications to the garden and revamp the house too. So William Kent was a genius of 18th century garden design. In addition to being a groundbreaking landscape architect, he was a painter, architect, furniture designer, and stage designer. He also designed the first baby carriage, which you can see right there. And before Kent, French, Dutch, Roman gardens with straight lines dominated the landscapes. The Kent garden is a wilderness garden with informal paths, trees planted in groups instead of allays. And he was one of the brilliant rogues of history. He would come to stay with you. Well, first, he never showed up on time. He did not answer letters. He did not send invoices. He did not pay his bills. And he would come to stay with you. He would drink all your wine. He would sleep with your wife. He would sleep with your daughters. But he would charm you. So, with each garden, we're going to show you a series of plans that illustrate the basic ideas. I find when Paul and I walked through these gardens, we didn't really understand the bones and how they hold together. So that's why we drew all these plans. So each garden, you'll see the layers of design moves that move from the introduction to the axes and the layering in of the informal arrangement of trees and architecture to make each garden archetypal English garden. So this diagram, you see the house is right here in terracotta, and all the secretary buildings are over there in terracotta. So first, the first design principle. The gardens adjacent to the house have an axis organizing the formal portions. And notice, off the landscape, there's secondary axes right over here. I call these localized axes, and they align with water features and garden follies. So Kent spent 10 years in Rome studying architecture, and this was a major influence in his garden. So this little red path, this gives you an idea of the path that grows through the woods, and it's organic and natural, and it emphasizes the idealized English landscape. Kent imagined each garden as a journey, a meandering path through woodland, punctuated by carefully placed structures that reveal themselves gradually. So at the beginning of our journey, the arrival in front of the house is framed by the romantic English landscape. And the garden inside the house is the first of one of Kent's techniques, Galpaha. It's a recessed wall that preserves views while keeping the livestock securely in the field without the need of hedges or fences to interrupt the view. Something we could use out here, the deer. And then, this is really important. We're seeing an aerial view, and this is the house Rovam. And beyond it, there's this axis that organizes these eye catchers. So that's what's really cool about it. So there's amazing principle, something I learned about college, the whole idea of the eye catcher. So, the first of the formal elements are located adjacent to the house. First, we have the bowling green. It's a large rectangular lawn center of the house. It's the beginning of the axis that extends in the distant landscape. Second, at the end of the first point on the axis at the end of the bowling green is the statue of a lion and a horse. And then in the distance, peeking out through the trees, there's the old mill. I think you can see it right there. And the old mill was an existing building. What Kent did was he had to use Gothic style alteration to create a romantic run. And then high in the hills, he created a faux medieval run, a large triple arch folly called the eye catcher. Its sole purpose was to direct the eye to the fields above the garden, to give the impression that the house's landscape extended far beyond its boundaries, to extend the perceived boundaries of space. Then off of the woods, we'll experience temples and follies that are Italian-inspired, and scenes will be revealed. You'll come out of the woods, you'll see yourself in Kent's genius. He is really a stage designer. The Dying Gladiator, the first of the classical statues along the meandering path. The urn placed above the river. This is the second feature along the path. And what's important about Kent's designs, the urn as a point of punctuation as you meander along the path. The urn contrasts with the natural landscape beyond, therefore making both stand out, creating a romantic painting stage set. The Praenista, named after the ancient Roman town, has views that open up to the valley. It's also called the Cryptoporticus, arcade as a retaining wall. And then down to the woods to the Temple of Echo, it's also called the Townsend Building. It's a temple in the front with plasters and a pennant, but it has a sash window on the side. What you end up with is Rome, but Rome with its feet firmly in Oxford Village. And then there's a watery walk, it's like serpentine room, that introduces a naturalistic element, winding gently through the landscape. And this leads you to the Vale of Venus. It's on the secondary axis of the garden. The axis connects two upper ponds to the Vale of Venus at the bottom of the hill. And then Kent's final flourish is a funerary symbol referencing the death figures of Julius Caesar and Socrates, and architecture memento mori embedded in the landscape. The visit concludes with a walk through a 17th century walled garden where dovecote stands amid Oxford parterres, an echo of earlier horticultural traditions. And now we move, like in the late 18th century, we arrive at Blenheim Palace and Gardens. It's located just north of Oxford, and the house and garden reflects many of the ideas Paul talked about, from the formal principle to the incorporation of natural principles. It was completed in 1725. It was a gift to the nation to John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, in his recognition of his victory of the French Battle of Blenheim. The Churchill family remained stewards of the state for generations, but by the late 19th century, the family faced financial ruin. So Charles Spencer Churchill, the ninth Duke of Marlborough, came to New York and married Consuelo Vanderbilt, who you can see over in that picture, to get the money to save Blenheim. Of course, the marriage did not last. You can watch this on season 3, Gilded Age, HBO. So, now, gardens are not saved in amber. They evolved over time. This is note, the original gardens were laid out in 1705 by the royal gardener Henry Weiss in a formal design. But it was Lancelot Capability Brown, 1774, transformed the grounds into the classic English landscape. And then, in the early 20th century, the French designer Kelly Duchesne introduced the formal gardens adjacent to the palace. Back to the diagrams again, and you see the overall plan. I just want to point out, this is the palace. So first, we have the axes extending from the house in the landscape. And this is used to organize the garden, and extend the architecture of the house into the garden. This is the concept that came from the Italian Renaissance, which Paul previously discussed. The axis is articulated in the landscape by the addition of trees on each side of the axis. This is known as an alley of trees. The axis is further defined by room making on the axis by trees, garden walls, and parterre. And the truly dark green, I think it's dark green, did I get it right?
Yes.
Okay, the dark green, okay. So the dark green is the natural woods, that's the next layer of design that goes into this entire garden. It has the natural water features that were created by Kent. So here we have a house. We rotated the plan so north is up, so you could zoom into the formal gardens on each side of the house. These two gardens are called parterre gardens. The word parterre in French means on the ground. Typically, parterres are located adjacent to the house, so you can look down on them and appreciate the geometry. And just a reminder, parterres are made of low hedges, about 2 feet tall, usually of a plant called a boxwood. In boxwood, I think you're all familiar with it, but it's truly an architectural plant that would be pruned into tight, precise geometric shapes. The Great Court reinforces the central axis of the estate. And then, this is another picture of the Great Court, and it's large, symmetrical, and imposing. But most important, the example of English Baroque architecture, shirtless style, the canon of British architecture tonight. I don't see it a lot anywhere. Then, this is the East Entry Court, it's like the service entrance, and it's another axis on the palace grounds. And then, on the east side of the palace, we have the Italian gardens, a parterre garden that's meant to be viewed from above. The upper water terraces on the west side of the house first start with parterres, immediately adjacent to the house, similar to the Italian gardens in respect to being a series of formal gardens that step down a hill. And now we're at the bottom of the hill. This is called the lower water terraces, and where you have 2 reflecting pools framing a view of the lake. And within the pools are obelisks, scaled down versions of Bernini's Piazza Navona in Rome. They reflect and reinforce the Italian heritage of the gardens. And beyond the water terrace, at the end of the axis from the house, is the lake and the beginning of the naturalistic landscape by Capability Brown. And then, from this vantage, the estate's design becomes clear. The central axis unites Brown's pastoral, the palace with Brown's pastoral fields and lakes, while the terraces on the side serve as a transitional zone, bridging the architectural formality of the palace to the naturalistic sweep of the landscape beyond. And then the natural romantic landscape created by Capability Brown. And one criticism of Capability Brown, he was so good at imitating nature. After moving tons of earth and thousands of trees, it did not look like he did anything. So now I pass this on to Paul. We did on trust that.
Sorry, now I need to find my spot here. But isn't this weather blue? Yeah, so lucky.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Michael. So we now shift our focus from the grand 18th century estates of dukes and generals to a more intimate scale garden design that emerged in the late 1800s, a scale that may be familiar to you in your own garden out here on the East End. Iford is located west of London in the Cotswolds. When the rise of industrialism created enormous new wealth in England and a new class of affluent professionals such as Harold Peto, who you see here, an architect and landscape designer who worked all over Britain, as well as on the Côte d'Azur in France at the turn of the 20th century, where he bought sculpture and architectural fragments, by the way, like a classic Victorian, he brought everything, and then brought it back and imagined that he would build a garden with all of these, all of his collection, which he did. That's what we're looking at here. So, marking the entrance to his house, Peto's statue of Britannia is part of his immense collection of classical objects. Despite his love of Mediterranean classicism, though, Peto used the arts and crafts garden of his time as a foundation for the classical objects that inspired him from his trips to Italy. Here we see the overall plan, and there are two main gardens, so let's walk with me. This is the house right here. There are two main gardens. This is the hill garden up here, and then south of the road is the lower garden down here, and I'll show you both of those. The rooms are long and narrow and follow the contours of the hill as they do in Italian gardens. The hill is going that way. But if you look at this diagram on the left, you see that there's this orange line. That's the main axis that goes up and down the hill. In a typical Italian garden, there would have been gardens on both sides. The garden that I showed you earlier had beautiful ones on both sides. Peto didn't have that much land. And so his garden is kind of like an Italian garden, but also like a cottage garden. It's smaller, it's more intimate, and it's more casual than a classic Italian garden, which I think makes it more interesting to certain way. Here in this aerial view, I've added a rough sketch section to show you how the gardens step. So the garden is stepping down this way. At the bottom of the hill, you see the house. So you enter the garden from the bottom and step up. These are all the garden terraces. And then you end up over here in a beautiful building that Peto designed where you can sit and look down over the valley. The south garden entrance is marked by a familiar figure, another dying gladiator. They're very popular in the 19th century. Perched above the lintel to celebrate the portal. Within, a walled garden in the arts and crafts manner frames views through walls. The garden is dominated with topiary sculpture that allude to the playful qualities of the Tudor gardens, which were key to the arts and crafts tradition. You're going to see later that King Charles also leans into these playful sculptures in his garden. Then, returning to the main house, the larger garden is access to that portal on the right. The garden wall goes right up to the house, and it leads visitors around to a side garden anchored by a loggia at the end of the house. Here, home and garden greet each other, extending the house outdoors in the arts and crafts manner. This space also serves as a prelude to the Italianate gardens up the hill. Stairs lead up to the first terrace with dramatic views back down to the entrance court as urns from Peto's collection punctuate the corners of the walls. You also start to see the surrounding countryside from this location. It's very dramatic. The central terrace is defined by two complete colonnades that Peto brought back from Italy. Flower borders are beautiful up close, but you see through these colonnades out to that countryside. And the top terrace is marked by a loggia that showcases Peto's medieval colonnettes in a structure designed by Peto using local materials. It is designed to be a place of rest while serving as a retaining wall for the back of the garden at the top of the hill, a bit like the cryptoporticus that Michael described to you. Then one level down, a gravel path marks the longest terrace, a colonnade seen off you see the colonnade off in the distance, and collections of planters, benches, and sculptures to either side marking the path. This axis leads to a pavilion also designed by Peto, acting as an eye catcher, as Michael described, while also being able to serve for a tea party. All of these pavilions tend to be miniature, especially in a small garden, by the way, to make the gardens appear larger when seen from a distance, but you can squeeze a little tea party in there. That pavilion, in turn, opens up to a picturesque borrowed landscape of surrounding farms, a technique that comes from both Italian and Chinese traditions. I'm always thinking of borrowed landscapes out here, like that tree in my neighbor's garden looks so amazing from over here. And you can plan around that tree in your neighbor's garden. But Peto has more and more surprise for us, a new building that incorporates the most important part of his collection. Here our group approaches the structure, and as we enter, the pink stucco entrance incorporates more architectural fragments, leading in turn to a full historic cloister to drag back to England, which adds the weight of history to Peto's inventions. Those of you who have been to the cloisters in Upper Manhattan will be familiar with the Northern European mania for buying cloisters and bringing them home. From the cloister, the view back to the naturalistic garden, punctuated with classical structures, is a miniature evocation of the grand hunting ground gardens that Michael just showed you. Now we continue forward to about 1920, to an even smaller garden, one perhaps overshadowed by its house, and certainly by the great early 20th century intellectuals who frequently visited. Charleston Farmhouse is located in the Sussex countryside and was the home of two great artists at the center of the Bloomsbury group, Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant. This was the unofficial country house of the Bloomsbury group, an influential circle of writers, artists, and thinkers who all met at Cambridge. Their personal lives were famously complex. Here, portraits of the group are connected with yellow arrows indicating marriages, just two of those, and many more red arrows indicating sexual relationships. Dorothy Parker said about the Bloomsbury group that they lived in squares, London squares, they drew in circles, their modern paintings, and they loved in triangles, as you see up here on the map. Most of them were really lovely artists, too, and these are either portraits of themselves or portraits of their friends. It's a wonderful place to visit. As World War I broke out in 1914, the gentlemen of the group, staunch pacifists, refused military service. Instead, they were assigned to agricultural labor out in the countryside so they could assist in the war effort in their own way. So after separating from her husband, Clyde Bell, who you see here on the left, Vanessa Bell in the center moved to Charleston House with her lover, Duncan Grant, who you see on the right in his self-portrait, another post-impressionist artist. Her brief affair with Duncan cooled off quickly, perhaps due to his homosexuality. That's a case I did, by the way. But she and Duncan remained soulmates and Clyde Bell stayed in the picture, staying in the house for long periods of time, and everyone remained friends. Lovely time for all. On the simple site plan, you can see the house in terracotta. It's the smallest garden that we'll look at today. It features just two primary elements, a pond in a naturalistic setting, and a walled cottage garden with axial connections to the house in the arts and crafts manner. The organizing axes extend out from the house into the garden at the top and through the motor court to the lake on the lower right. The house itself is a simple Sussex farmhouse renovated with large 19th century windows. But the interior is the real focus in Charleston. The walls and furnishings were transformed, mostly by Duncan and Vanessa, over a 50-year period into a canvas for their post-impressionist aesthetic. This is the sitting room and painting studio in which caryatides were painted to frame the fireplace. Duncan and Vanessa were often inspired by Italian frescoes, continuing that long-standing Anglo obsession with all things Italian. Here we see the rest of the studio with Duncan's many paintings of male nudes. You have no idea, they're everywhere. And this is partly to honor, by the way, Cape Hyde. If you're here, you'd actually get more of a sense of, like, God, I can only show one, should there be children in the audience. Here we see portraits, busts, and silhouettes. And here on the right, we see hand-block wallpaper and curtain fabric designed by Duncan. They were very interested in product design in addition to painting. And you can still buy some of these fabrics through Charleston House. They're really lovely, as well as napkins, etc. From the sitting room, one can look directly back out into the garden. And feeling like an extension of interior rooms, the garden is centered on the lawn panel surrounded by flower borders and trees. We were there very early in the season, which is why you only see bulbs here. And I couldn't find the perfect picture to show you with all the flowers out. The garden plan was initially drawn by Roger Fry, a painter, art critic, and a founding member of the Bloomsbury group. He was a big proponent of the Cubists in England. That's his self-portrait on the right, by the way. He was also a painter. His sketch on the left shows a forward-looking geometric planting plan, perhaps influenced by the Cubism of Picasso. The Bloomsbury group liked to set themselves apart from the strictures of the 19th century, but the planting plan done on the right by Gertrude Jekyll some 40 years earlier, with its drifts of flowers, more accurately describes the planting strategy that was actually carried out at Charleston. Here is a simple garden entrance on the left, and on the right, a flower border on the continuous cottage garden wall. Here, sculpted yews engulfed sculpture. And finally, the two garden paintings on the right, one by Duncan and one by Vanessa, are a reminder that this garden was meant to be an inspiration to two great English interwar painters. This was a family scene eating in the garden, by the way, and this was an abstracted view of the pond, one of those circles that we were referring to earlier. And so the relationship between gardens and art is brought full circle from ancient China, as I showed you at the beginning of this talk, to early 20th century England, and of course it would ultimately continue here to Long Island, as you're all very well aware. Now we continue to Badminton Estate. The gardens was designed, this garden, we're here for gardens that were designed recently in the 1980s. The name may be familiar to you. This is where the famous lawn game was invented hundreds of years ago. It is situated in the pastoral landscape of Gloucestershire and is an historic estate with an enduring legacy. The estate was originally founded in the 13th century and came into the Somerset family in 1655, in whose hands it remains today. We're stopping here not for ancient gardens, but for gardens designed in the very early 1980s by one of the most influential landscape architects of the 20th century, Russell Page. You see his picture here on the left, with later additions by his protege, Francois Goffinet, on the right. Russell Page, despite referring to himself as the greatest gardener you've never heard of, is seen by many as the designer that brought landscape architecture into the 20th century. Clientele ranging from private aristocrats to major corporations, his work is characterized by a unique blend of structure and personal expression, creating gardens that were both elegant and emotionally resonant. He's very influential. Page's design for the Villa Silvia Pellico south of Turin, Italy, is a simple but exquisitely proportioned step garden that some have lauded as the very essence of the Italian classic garden, even though it was designed by an Englishman. Note the use of gray sage instead of flowers to fill in between the boxwood parterre. Mr. Page was known for a subtle taste and for his addition of minimalism when it suited him. The massing, here we come back to the house. The massing of Badminton House is laid out with buildings that are wall-like and wind around the landscape to create a series of outdoor rooms. Russell Page added formal parterres to the east court on the right of this diagram, and an extensive new garden to the south in the center of this page, over what used to be a kitchen garden as well as a service area. Like Peto, his gardens were divided into a series of classically inspired rooms. However, in this case, Page did away with the sculpture in favor of hedges and topiary. Russell Page once said that above all, I am an architect of gardens. He was very proud of the idea that he thought of himself as an architect. This is his detailed architectural plan for the East Garden. Here the house is located on the left, though it's not shown on the drawing, and the hunting grounds are on the right beyond the drawing again. The dark lines are low hedges that define the extent of the lawn panel. The lawn panel is also called a tapis vert, or a green carpet in French, or when you hear that by some fancy garden person, you know what it is. The diagonal lines of hedges create a forced perspective, which, along with the allées of trees, lead the eye to the woodlands on the right. Here on the east facade is the result of Page's sketch design. Configured to maintain a visual focus on the historic facade, Page's simple lawn panel is framed by low gridded parterres adjacent to the outbuildings. A strong cross-axis across the lawn panel from one parterre to another connects to replicated classical pavilions. Page takes his cues from architecture wherever he can. And here we have an aerial view of the house showing the motor court with the entrance to the house in the foreground. The east garden that we just saw is to the left, and the major garden that we're going to see next is behind the house, extending towards the top of the image. In that garden, the large garden, and in typical Russell Page manner, low rectilinear parterres provide an overall order punctuated with shade trees. Taller hedges help to define rooms, but notice that the hedges are sometimes objects, screens that imply rooms while maintaining their identity as standalone objects. You can see some of that out here in this garden. Page drew his inspiration from both classical and modernist traditions. This garden is composed of 3 parts. The middle garden is a round space divided by a low hedge centered on the church to the east and by a lone tree to the west. The tree completes the axis that starts at the church. The garden closest to the house is defined by square parterres, each surrounding a fountain as they might in a medieval cloister garden. Trees are trimmed in spheres that feel modern, but also reference the ordered geometries of the garden as a symbol of paradise in Elizabethan traditions. He really knew his landscape history, and it really helped to make his gardens rich, I think. In the third garden, furthest from the house, parterres are centered on conical yews, perhaps serving as a transition to the nearby forest, or at least that's what it seemed like to us as we were walking around. There, of course, also a reference to classic French gardens. He manages to make a clean modern garden that still echoes centuries of European tradition. And finally, a colorful carpet of spring bulbs celebrates the transition from these formal gardens to the surrounding forest. Page and Goffinet enjoyed a painterly informality when it was appropriate. Now we arrive at one of the most beloved gardens in England. Several of you will remember this. Oh my gosh. Sissinghurst Castle Garden is a site that blends literary legacy with romantic complexity, all on top of historic architecture, a sophisticated plan, and horticultural brilliance. It is located in the countryside of Kent, in the southeast of England, an area known as the Garden of England due to its rich soil and mild climate. It's not so different in a way from the east end of Long Island. The garden was designed by Sir Harold Nicholson, who was a diplomat, and Vita Sackville-West, his wife, who, like their contemporaries in the Bloomsbury group, shared a complicated marriage, in part to cover their extramarital same-sex relationships, another pride offering. Still, their bond was strong. They raised 2 children together, and they shared a passion for garden design. Many have observed that the garden reflects the duality of their relationship. Vita Sackville-West is perhaps the first modern celebrity that we talked about today. She was well known as an author of poems, novels, and a weekly garden column in The Observer. She was also famous, eventually, for the love affair she carried out with Virginia Woolf, the sister of Vanessa Bell, who we just met at Charleston House. This was a small, incestuous world. Vita's energy was, at least in part, due to an early bitter disappointment. As a woman, she was unable to inherit Noel, her beloved 330-room palace that she had grown up in as an only child. You can imagine the trauma of having to leave this pile when you're 19 years old, if you're a woman. She felt her identity was deeply intertwined with Noel and with the history of her grand family. But the ancient law of primogeniture meant that Noel had to go to the closest heir, her uncle. She was devastated. But in 1930, Vita and Harold came upon the remains of another 16th century house, this one called Sissinghurst, which remarkably also had connections to Vita's family. She was thrilled on multiple levels. They both loved the romance of the place in its ruined state, which you can see on the left in an aerial view taken about the time that they bought the place. And on the right, you can see an aerial view of the castle in better times, slightly better times, in the 1700s. Over the next 30 years, from about 1930 to the mid-60s, the property was transformed into a garden with a complex geometric plan laid out by Harold with with famously accomplished plantings by Vita. This plan shows that the garden was paramount. There is no central house. They lived among several pavilions. They lived between the tower, which is here, to this house where Harold and Vita slept, to this little house here, originally called the priest house, where the children slept. And that was sometimes inconvenient, and the children especially remember how inconvenient it was. And for more details, you should read their son Nigel's book, Portrait of a Marriage, which is wonderful, written after he found out all of his mother's love letters that she had written in her early 20s. He felt he had a right to get it out of the system. The site is organized by Nicholson's axes. He was so obsessed with getting the plan right that he conferred with the great architect Edwin Lutyens on several occasions. He didn't get it totally perfect, by the way, which is one of the charms of the garden. Every space in the garden is a room with a specific name and vision of its own. It's totally different from the vast gardens that Michael is showing you with their axes extending endlessly out to the horizon. I'll take you on a tour of some of the spaces. The entrance is through the west, through a wall-like building called the West Range, through the center gate that was the original entrance of the cour d'honneur of the Tudor house. The tower is the focus of the first court, a simple lawn rectangle. Both a gateway and a center, the tower is visible as an icon from almost anywhere in the garden. It's the only garden I've seen like this, by the way. Like in New York, you look for the Empire State Building. Both Vita, finally in an ancestral home, took the tower as her office, a place from which to survey her gardens and in which to write. From the tower, looking down, the garden's complex layout is revealed, divided into a series of rooms defined sometimes by historic walls and yew hedges at other times. Each space is distinct, yet a part of a coherent whole. You can also see the famous roundel on the lower right that ties together the four parts of the rose garden. Vita invented the exuberant planting schemes in this garden throughout, such as this purple border on the left, while Harold connected the garden with a network of paths. On the right, you can see my partner Dan walking through one of those paths in the garden. The first garden that they created was the rose garden in the former kitchen garden. Vita filled these rooms with old roses dating back before the first hybrid that was only created in 1867, which I find so interesting. She thought that hybrids were too perfect and lacked the complex lineage and romance of old roses. I believe she thought of herself as a bit of an old rose with complex lineage. In keeping with the theme of variety, the next garden room adjoining this cottage garden is dominated by a warm color scheme of red and orange flowers. It in turn leads to the lime walk, Harold's design and his pride. Vita was more of a fan of the irregular, however, and she made light of this alley and called it a train station. They argued about the garden constantly, but in the end they got together and made a bit of a masterpiece. The Hazel Nuttery is next. It's an ancient orchard, original property. It was one of the old-fashioned features that made Harold and Vita fall in love with the place. Now expanded onto a carpet of ferns, it is one of the coolest summer rooms in the garden. The nuttery, in turn, leads to the herb garden, which is used as a sunny anchor at the end of the primary axis. The paving here, a charming pattern of bricks and tiles salvaged from the ruins of the original house, is classic arts and crafts in its reliance on locally available materials. Sometimes these historic materials are still intact, such as at this historic Tudor wall that defines the edge of the moat walk, now also lined with yellow and orange azaleas. Luckily, those were blooming when we were there. Among the most celebrated inventions at Sissinghurst is the White Garden, one of the last gardens created by Vita. It is planted exclusively in shades of gray-green foliage and white flowering plants. It has become one of the most iconic and influential gardens in the world. Some of you probably have one of these in your own garden. I don't. Gardens have for centuries been autobiographical, but it seems to me that they became more so in the 20th century. For instance, Harold and Vita were obsessed with the Greek island of Delos, which they had visited when they were young. And they were inspired to create a modern memento of their memories there. Unfortunately, their efforts failed in the colder, wetter climate of Kent. However, 60 years after their deaths, other gardeners working with the Sissinghurst Foundation have been able to realize that original Deela's fantasy, and a new garden was opened to the public just as we arrived. It's lovely to see. So far, it's holding out. Sissinghurst is probably my favorite of these gardens, perhaps because it was both designed and realized by its owners, making it unusually personal. This image depicts the couple towards the end of their lives. On the right, you see Harold in a suit, Robert the diplomat, and Vita in her dirty boots, ready to continue her garden work. But now back to Michael as our garden tour continues into the late 20th century.
Well, that was just great. And finally, we're in the 21st century. We arrive at Bourn Park. It's a manor house located in Wiltshire, south of Oxford. And at first glance, one would think Bourn Park was designed for the kingly England. But with the restrained elegance of the house and gardens, it was actually for Lady Rothermere and Viscount Rothermere. The gardens were designed by Lady Rothermere, a self-taught gardener, and she was most inspired by Russell Page, who we talked about at Badminton. The house was designed by Terry, one of the foremost classical architects of modern Britain. But most important, the house was completed in 2002. Please remember this date. The front of the house is a 4-square classical pile inspired by Palladio on a raised rusticated base. The facade evokes the grandeur of 18th century architecture we previously saw Blenheim reinterpreted into the 21st century. The side plan again, building terracotta, and this is the house. The addition of axes organize the landscape, and the house has 2 major axes extending the landscape to the woods. But also note, off in the woods, there are secondary axes, similar to what we saw with Rovam, with multiple axes organizing follies in the woods. The addition of the alleys of trees and parterres reinforce the axis. The addition of the woods and groves of trees beyond the formal moves. The entrance to the court in front of the house echoing the theatrical arrival of Blenheim 450 years earlier. The arrival court centered on the north side of the house. And one could tell this is the front of the house by the use of the pediment and the Corinthian columns. The motor court is a perfect rectangle centered on the house. But there's something quite unusual here. Lady Rothermere introduced plants growing in the ground of the motor court. This is a recurring theme with the house and the garden. Nature creeping in to this very formal grand architecture. These are not weeds, they're actually a plant called Whalen. You see it out here, it's deer resistant and poisonous in a biennial. And I've never seen this in East Hampton, except in Debbie Nevin's driveway. And I've seen it in Virginia and Buddy Mellon's Port Motorport, so the message you can plant your driveway. You don't have to use Roundup. So finally, beyond the motor court on the axis of the house is a bowling green with yew hedges flipped as obelisks around the fountain, inspired by Bernini's Fountain of Rome and Russell Page in the romantic English landscape in the distance. The back of the house, the garden facade, notice the simplicity of the facade, no blasters. The parterres center the garden facade, seen from the raised terrace adjacent to the house. As a reminder, parterres are ideally seen from above to appreciate the geometry. The side of the house, the beginning of secondary access. But most important and most unusual, lichen, mold, and moss cover the stones of the facade. This allows the exterior house to age and gain patina, as if the house was in the family for centuries, not 20 years. And I have not seen this in any post-World War II buildings in the United States. It was more common in the United States from the Gilded Age to World War II. You could actually see this at the Yale University, at the colleges designed by James Gamble Rogers. He actually poured acid on the stone to age it. And there's another architect, Harry T. Lindbergh. He used to do it too. There's one of his houses on Lily Pond Lane. Again, this is the that side. You see plants popping up from the stone, nature overtaking architecture, not weeds. And also notice this the side of that pavilion is just covered with mold. Deliberately. And then the alley of trees and a wild meadow centered on this facade. And then off in the woods, we'll discover an entirely new axis and formal moves in its own little world. A stair terracing down the hill to a garden centered on the pool. The garden for the 20th century concept, the swimming pool. A statue of a monument presides over the pool, a nod to the Enlightenment. And then centered on the pool is a summer house, inspired by the Prayadista of Russia. The axis centered on the pool extends through the summer house to a natural lake on the other side, inspired by William Kent. A skillful play going from a very formal axis centered on an informal water feature, a common theme in the English romantic landscape. And it's also a concept at LongHouse. Notice the axis of the house extends to Peter's Pond, which is more sinuous and romantic. So that's something you see here. Then finally, we're going back 20 years to the garden of Highgrove, King Charles Garden. It's west of Oxford. It's actually my favorite garden in the entire tour, the least favorite of everyone. Most people hate it. Paul Whalen described it as a garden of a person with a tortured childhood. But this garden was a chance for Charles to have all his experiments and inspirations in one place. The house was built in the late 18th century in the Georgian neoclassical style. Charles purchased the house in 1980. It just happened to be down the road from Cumnell Park with Bowles home. And just at the same time, Charles was dating Diana, and they married in 1981. Charles, Diana, Harry, William in front of Highgrove. By this time, the marriage had gone totally off the rails. Charles was back with Camilla. You could watch this on the ground. But beyond the marriage, the house and garden represented Charles' love of sustainable gardening and architecture. He was ahead of his time, criticized for being eccentric, and he also talked to his plants. So when Charles bought the house, there was some structure to the garden. A lay of yews with a gravel walk centered on the house as seen in this photo of 1982. The first bones of the garden are here. The rest of the garden is just a neglected kitchen garden and pasture land. A quick walk the diagrams again, buildings in terracotta, and this is the main house right here. Distract this. Okay. So, a quick walk to the plans, similar ones we presented, and you can see how Highgrove has the same basic trust scheme as all the other gardens. There's a criticism that looks like he bought everything at the garden store. So I still liked it. So the axis extends from the house, and there's secondary axes on the side of the house. And then you see a walled garden in the woods, but also another axis. The axes are reinforced with the alleys of trees and outdoor rooms. And then, I got off sync. And then the overseas are green. There's a more naturalistic woods beyond, and as we go on an adventure, you can meet the mind of the king. The front of the house, a classical house, with the vines and nature climbing facade, is a true English cottage garden. This takes what we saw at Fern Park 6th Street, where nature wins. The gardens by the house, nature winning. This is the terrace, one of the first gardens created by Highgrove, designed by Charles. And notice the paving. It's a regular with Mediterranean plants growing between the cracks, taking the ideas from Fern Park to Fern Park 6th Street. And near the house, at the beginning of the time walk, is the oak pavilion, a counterweight to the Georgian architecture of the house. And then an avenue of clipped golden yews, one of the remaining plants from the original garden, lines the time wall. And the king's suggestion, the yews were clipped into eccentric geometric shapes. Between them we have the stone path, and then on each side you have this flying ornate hedge, so it sort of controls the chaos. And then it just wait, let me get the seek again. Then you see the time walk again on axis of the house. I should have pages in the right place. And then what happens? You go on you keep on going, and then you see we have an idea that I had was, so the first point along this axis is this lily pond garden. And then you keep on going, and you have the bronze gladiator, which is the second point along the axis. And then the axis provides the third point, which is a buff dovecote, a gift from the Sultan al-Aman. Now, and then as we move the woods, this would be a collection of follies and gardens. And it's at the beginning of the woods, we have this wall of gifts hitting Gothic architectural stone. Some which were given to the king, some were collected by him. The green oak sanctuary, one of the first of follies in the woods. The stumpery. Stumpery is based on the Victorian concept of growing ferns and tropicals among tree stumps. It's a really eccentric feature. I've never seen this in the US. There's actually one at Ontomeyer Gardens. Also, I think there's one in the greenhouse at Brookside Gardens in Maryland, but something we just never ever see. And then at the heart of the woods, there's a classical temple built from green oak, cut to resemble stone, with pieces of tree root decorating the pediment. Notice it's the edge of the stumpery, but now we have the rotted tree roots in the pediment. And here we have Charles has a sense of humor. This is the me hedge. Charles received many gifts over the year, most being his bust, so he placed them in a single hedge. And finally, King Charles, Queen Camilla, a fairy tale ending in a enchanted garden. And here is the stuff of which fairy tales are made of. A quote from the Archbishop of Canterbury for Charles and Diana's wedding. They lived happily ever after. And also, I tried to get wine from Highgrove, King Charles Winery, but he's not selling anymore. So we reached out to Meghan Markle, so we're having as ever wine from the Napa Valley today.
Thank you.
Almost done.
Yeah, you're right.
That's great.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you all for joining us today. We did this lecture because we wanted to share the trip, but also we wanted to talk about how gardens aren't just a bunch of plants. Gardens express ideas, visions of power, paradise, Elysium. They romanticize journeys through history or faraway places and represent encounters with nature and personal identity. Most of the gardens we saw today started out as private gardens, but they ended up being passed on to the public. You see this as something similar out here on East End with Meadow and LongHouse. These gardens remind me of Sissinghurst and Highgrove, and that both of these places were highly personal, but were eventually transferred from their original owners to being open now to new generations of designers, managers, and enthusiasts. The trip began by being fascinated by these gardens and other great gardens close to New York, and we wanted to share with you what we learned. Now, this is the plan of LongHouse, by the way, and there was a comment about, or even a comment about LongHouse gardens and are they connected at all to what we saw? And I think, and so I've been thinking about this for 3 minutes. And clearly, the LongHouse garden, a lot of it is very Asian inspired, I think, through its irregularity. But what's really critical to the success of LongHouse is the axis of these two yew hedges, which are so interesting. And they divide the property up into 4 quadrants. And those 4, and then the house is in one quadrant, and the pond is in another quadrant. Other features sort of spin around. And those quadrants remind me of, first of all, of a Cardo-Decimanus, the 2 main streets in a Roman town. It's a very, very ancient idea of drawing a cross on the ground and then organizing yourself around that. They also remind me, it's the Cartesian idea of a grid. This is the plus sign is the beginning of a grid. And so in my mind, there's a connection to Versailles and to the sort of French notions of organizing the world onto a plat of grids. And then finally, it seems very American to me. I don't know if anybody ever said this, but it seems very American to me because all of the US was really platted out in a grid, which grows out of this Cartesian idea that you organize your world with a grid, and then you figure out where you are based on where you are in that grid. So there's something in the end there's some Asian qualities here, but they're also both modernist and sort of something very classically American to me about sort of that grid coming together and organizing this irregular collection of beautiful, sometimes Asian, sometimes classical inspired gardens. So we did get a little something out of this trip. Thank you for coming. It's been a total pleasure.
Thank you.